Namaste. Welcome to our first yoga philosophy session. What is yoga? When you hear the word yoga, I'm sure you're thinking of postures, seeing people doing yoga practice, the physical practice of yoga. Maybe some of you think of meditation or sounding the sound Om or chanting the sound Om. But yoga actually means to unify, to yoke, or to unite. To unite all aspects of self. And those aspects are your physical body, the mind, and then your soul spark, which is called jiva, or the soul or spirit. So when these three unify in equanimity, in balance, in full true union, it is said we arrive into a state of ecstasy, of bliss, called Samadhi. And this is really when the fun starts, is when we get into states of this pure bliss, this pure ecstasy, this feeling of intrinsic joy and happiness. When you get to that state of true yoga, things outside of ourselves will never fulfill us. Because when we come into that true state of yoga, we have access to that intrinsic joy and happiness from within. We are nurtured from within, and we don't seek it outside of ourselves. And that's the end of suffering as well. Because the moment we rely on others for our happiness or to fill the void within, we set ourselves up for pain and for challenges and suffering. So yoga ultimately is a path of rediscovering the self, to know what is true for us and what isn't. Yoga is also a way to really master your life force, which is the breath. And the breath is truly the most important aspect of yoga. It isn't the asanas. It isn't about contorting into the most advanced postures. And you see, that often can lead us into the play of ego, where we feel important. Look what I can do. Look what I can achieve. And of course, don't get me wrong, these are really great aims, but the intention shouldn't be to contort ourselves into advanced postures. If the intent is to go towards evolution of self, and if that involves breaking the barrier of your mind that is saying, oh, I can't do this and that, then yes, working towards an advanced posture may actually be an evolution of self. But when the sole purpose comes to showcase what you can do, then we've missed the point of yoga. Now, yoga is a journey. It's a lifelong journey. And Patanjali did a wonderful thing. He created the 8-limbed path, a systematic pathway to get to the aim of unifying the soul with the body and the mind. And it's called the 8-limbed path of Ashtanga. Ashta is 8 and Anga means limb. So the 8 limbs towards self-realization. And yoga asanas is actually the 3rd limb. There's 2 limbs before that, and those have actually nothing to do with a yoga practice at all. It's more about how we show up as an individual in relationship to the outside world and in relationship to our true self, towards ourself. And those are called the yamas and the niyamas, the observations, the personal observations, and then also the moral observations. You know, like the do's and don'ts of what is considered right action and what is incorrect action. So after yoga asana, which is the 3rd limb, we get pranayama, which is the 4th limb. Interesting. Pranayama comes after yoga asana. Most people always say, why isn't it before yoga asana? Well, you see, we need to start on the most outer layer of our body. To master ourselves, we need to start on the most dense level and go to the more subtle levels of ourselves. So the more potential way of reaching the true nature, the true self of a person, is then through the physical movements. Because let's say when you move, your breath starts to change. And the slow movements of yoga really promote deep yogic breathing. And if we would start it the other way around, you would try too hard to breathe. So it's through the yogic postures that you actually get better access to the breath. And then the pranayama techniques, which is the fourth limb, are far more accessible. And you feel far more that you can reach different levels of the techniques. Now, after pranayama, so once we get to master the life force, the energy, which we call prana in yoga, then there's something that happens is that we have a more intense focus. We have better concentration. We get that one pointed focus or awareness, which we call Darana. And when that one pointed awareness happens, there's something else that just happens right before that. In order for you to really focus on something with your eyes or your inner eyes, all the antennas of your other senses have to draw inward so that more energy can come into that one pointed focus. Because if you're still listening to sounds around you, then not all your energy is going into the one direction of one pointed attention. So we learn how to draw the antennas that normally go into the outside world, and we learn how to turn it inward. And that takes a lot of practice. So once we really start to master that, then we have a stronger dharana. And that's when we start to enter into the very first stages of meditation, which is called dhyana, the seventh limb of yoga. And of course, our mind is busy. Thoughts continue to run through the brain, through our awareness. And so often there is a wavering of that one pointed attention. So we have to trick the mind, and that's where we use our breath. And the breath anchors us into stillness. It gives the mind something to focus on so that it doesn't go out into the five senses. So once we get better at that one point of concentration, so let's say we're concentrating on a lotus flower. And let's say our eyes are closed and our inner eyes are turned on, and we're visualizing this lotus flower right at the center of our heart. And our awareness and direction of our energy is towards that lotus in the heart. Eventually, what starts to happen is that you become the lotus. You absorb into which you're concentrating on. And that's when we start to tap into Samadhi, which is the eternal enlightenment, the bliss state, the ecstasy. And many of you may already have a moment or two that you're in that state. And then you kind of go back out of it because you see the ego gets really afraid of that state because it feels like it's losing its grip. And then you come back and then your mind starts to go again. So yoga is about going further and further into that spaciousness that arises when you come into that state of full absorption. So mindfulness is the concentration onto that one point, onto the lotus flower. When you absorb into the lotus flower, then we arrive into soulfulness. We start to merge with our soul, and we get into these deep states of bliss, ecstasy. So that is really the aim of yoga, is to arrive into that state at any given moment. And it's through that inner equanimity that we arrive into that we can navigate the challenges in our life in much more graceful ways. You see, life is going to give us ups and downs. It's part of the play of life. It's part of being in a three-dimensional reality. It's part of being in a place where duality exists. So what does that mean? That you're not going to be faced as much with the ups and downs. It means that you're always in a state of balance, walking the middle path. When something great happens to you, of course, you're joyous, but your joy is within that understanding that it's just temporal. That external joy, let's say you won the lottery and you won $1,000. You're elated, right? But you also know that that $1,000 could be gone tomorrow. They could have made a mistake. So if you were so joyful and looking forward to it, and then let's say it falls away, then you would suffer. Then you would have anger arise. But when you don't really care whether that $1,000 comes or not, yes, of course, you're very grateful, but you're not going out of your hat about it. And then when something bad happens, you're like, okay, this is just a fluctuation. It's like a temporal fluctuation. I'm moving through it. But I know that eventually I'm going to come out of this. So what am I about to learn from this experience? And that is walking the middle path. That is the path of yoga. Now, in our next session, we will talk about the 4 yogic pathways. It is said that there's 4 different ways that we can reach the state that I just discussed with you, about coming into the state of equanimity, having deep access, great access to this feeling of unity, of oneness, of full balance with your true self, and to live in intrinsic joy and happiness. There's 4 different ways, which we call karma yoga, bhakti yoga, jnana yoga, and raja yoga. So in our next session, we'll talk about these 4 different yogic pathways and how they help us in attaining this oneness state and this path of equanimity towards self-realization and towards the greatest, most intrinsic joy you've ever experienced.